Welcome everybody to today's AMH Fellowship. Today we're going to be discussing the fundamentals of heathenry. Lesson 2, the ideology of heathenry. In this lesson we're going to go over the world around us and our place within it, as well as kind of some of the ideas behind what heathenry's perspective of the world really is. In our last lesson we discussed the history of heathenry. Went through its some of our source material that we use to define what we believe, and then talked about some of the modern interpretations of heathenry. And then in our next lesson, we'll get into the spirituality of heathenry, the actual parts of heathenry that involve our rituals and our deities. So this is a basic overview to just some of the concepts that are involved in a heathen worldview. It's meant to be an introduction. That's why it's the fundamentals of heathenry. A worldview is simply a overarching term to define our entire perspective of how we fit into the world. It answers some of the questions of why are we here, why is life important, what is our purpose. So how we answer those questions and how it then defines how we interact with others in the world, and that is what constitutes our worldview. The worldview may be very different depending on who you ask, even amongst heathens. However, what kind of makes a heathen worldview or a religious worldview in general a worldview is that it's shared. There are aspects of it that are similar to other people that share that faith and that tradition. So when we talk about heathenry as a worldview, I'll use the analogy that I like to use most often, is that I liken it to a room of paintings, all by the same artist. If you walk into that room, you look at all the paintings, you probably are going to recognize that they all come from a similar artist. There's going to be similarities in technique, paint styles and all that. The closer you get to any one picture, the more nuanced and different it gets. But having those similarities is what really defines it. And so when we talk about our worldview, when we see drastic differences that are, make it so that we don't look similar in any way, we can't tell where we're coming from, that's where we see uniqueness between opposing religious worldviews, right? So as a whole, these are the things that we're going to talk about in today's lesson. Really get back into those core elements that we talked about in the first lesson one. The three core elements of heathenry that define it as a faith tradition. The first being that we hold a worldview accepting fate as an influential and defining force within the universe and for all of its inhabitants. That we have a polytheistic and animistic perspective of divine and sacred entities, both in a spiritual and physical aspect. And that we'd focus on developing relationships through reciprocity with both spiritual and corporal beings. And so today we're really going to dig into what those core elements, kind of break them out a little bit further, what they mean, and what the aspects of a heathen worldview are that are aligned with those core elements. So first, let's talk about how do we understand the world that is around us. And we break it into 4 aspects. One being the cosmos in general, 2 the beings that are in the world, both physical and spiritual, and then finally how fate impacts all of those different elements. So when we look at the world around us, we look at the cosmos, we see that all things exist within distinct but interrelated realms. We call those realms just simply the physical and the spiritual. In a more academic sense, we can call that profane, the physical realm, and the sacred, the spiritual realm. And those words will come into play a little bit more during the lesson on spirituality of heathenry. But those are really just academic terms that we use in more theological setting. But the physical realm, that is the flora and the fauna of the world around us. It's where we exist when we are living, right? So that sense of being alive versus when we die and we pass away. Versus the spiritual realm, which is that realm of the supernatural, the incorporeal. It is that place into which we exist when we are dead, when we are not alive. And so the two distinct realms while they are interrelated, they are distinct. And we, in heathen worldview, they are separated in such a way that only very specific entities are able to bridge the distinction between them, except for in the case of certain things we call axis mundi, which is just a bridge. It's a term, again, an academic term to describe that thing which connects the physical and the spiritual. In Norse mythology, this is Yggdrasil, the cosmic tree. In the tree, Norse mythology talks about all the different realms of the world. Asgard, Midgard, Jotunheim, Helheim. All the different 9 realms are all aspects or parts of the cosmic world tree. They're all in the branches of Yggdrasil or in its roots. And so Yggdrasil serves as an axis mundi, a cosmic axis mundi, that allows a bridge between all the spiritual and the physical realm. Irminsul, the pole that is found in Anglo-Saxon heathenry, is also one, or the Bifrost that's talked about in Norse mythology, that allows the crossing over into Asgard. We see this manifested in human cultures, in our practice of heathenry and in pagan practices in general, through the use of sacred groves, horgar, ve, altars, sacred spaces, places that we recognize have a more deeply rooted connection to the spiritual from a physical plane. We see this throughout all of human history, really. We see the reference to places that are considered sacred or special, that were used for ritualistic worship of gods and spirits of the world, because they were thought to be a bridge or an axis mundi into that spiritual realm. And so we, when we look into heathen texts, to the sagas and the Eddas, we see clear references to this distinction between the physical and spiritual. When they talk about, in several sagas, they talk about that they buried, the king or a great warrior would die, and they were buried in the burial mound for the family, and then they would go visit them. They actually, and the way that they talked about it in the sagas is they would go to the burial mound and visit with the dead spirit of whoever this person was. And even to an extent, they even got into the physical, their body that was left behind, the draugr, would, sometimes be able to walk the earth, in some of those myths and stories. And then, so there's a clear distinction between, what was physical and what was spiritual, but we do see a blending of that in the person. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we see this, in the representation of places such as Valhalla, which is clearly a place where the dead souls, the spirits of dead warriors go, that are chosen by the Valkyrie to go to Valhalla. And this is clearly talked about as a very distinct and separate place from Midgard, the physical realm. And that when we see in the myths and the sagas, they are traversing between the two. It's usually only the gods, the Aesir, the Vanir, powerful beings such as they that can go from spiritual places to purely physical places. We don't really see any representation of people, profane as it were, beings being able to do that without the help of those sacred beings. And so, when we get into how we do ritual that we do, we just did a bloat as a community. When we do bloat, it is very much a practice of breaking into or breaking through that barrier from the physical into the spiritual. So that's the realms or the places that we consider that exist, and then how those interact is then defined by fate, right? And so when we talk about fate, we are talking about two very distinct aspects, which is orlog and weird. So in heathenry, part of our worldview is we believe that all existing things have an established fate that unites the world, and that they are defined by these two aspects, Orlog and Weird. So Orlog is a term, it literally means first law. It is a definitive and unalterable source for what we are or where we are at today. So a good example of this is our parentage, right? So all human beings, when you were born from a specific parentage. You had ancestors, you had grandparents, great-grandparents, mothers and fathers, parents, people that genetically led to your existence, right? And all of their decisions, everything that they did in life, led to your being born. From that second, the moment that you were born, all of that is set in law. There is nothing that can change that. And from that point, you're only able to then seek to influence what may happen next. So everything that comes before the moment we're in right now, we consider to be Orlog. And so this is a fundamental cosmic concept that is not just us, but goes into everything from the very creation of the universe, the cosmos, the gods themselves, the choices the gods made to create men and women, Ask and Embla, that then led to our ancestors making choices that led to us being born, which is going to lead to us giving rise to future generations, which ultimately will lead to Ragnarok, which then the cycle just keeps going, right? And so that's what it is. It's this cycle of Orlog moving into Weird, becoming the next Orlog, and then going back and forth. And so Weird is just that perpetual choice and influence that we strive to make upon what is happening now to then try to affect what is going to become Orlog in the next moment. We see this represented by Urd's Well in Norse mythology, and it's heavily influenced by both our past and what we're doing to influence it in the future, right? So in Norse heathenry, we look at luck as being a central aspect of our worldview. Not in the sense of gambling and hey, I played really well at cards the other night. More so in the sense of why we are able to be successful is based upon a well that we have fed into, that our ancestors have fed into, that is giving a luck or a sense of success to our Weird that creates better Orlog, right? So if we make good decisions, if we're putting a lot of effort into being successful, that is going to then lead to another moment of success. And so, that's what that luck is not just the sense of being, hey, I'm lucky. It's more of the overarching why you are lucky. Some people happen to be lucky because, they just everything seems to go their way, and maybe that's because their ancestry has given into and developed and really invested in the Weird of the family as they were going to create a great Orlog, which then is a fountain of luck that this individual can pull from. But it's both internal and external, and so we have both what you're doing, but also as we've been talking, we're saying hey, the things your ancestors did. If your ancestors made poor decisions, that would have had effect on you as well. But it's not just your ancestors; it's everything in the cosmos, right? It's all of the things that exist. Every choice that is being made is then feeding into what is going to happen next, right? And so you may be a very lucky person. You may make all the right decisions, and bad things may still happen, and so that may be something out of your control. That's an external influence. Something happened, right? You can be driving your car down the road, and another driver comes along and hits you, right? You didn't necessarily, maybe you did nothing wrong. You weren't speeding. You were looking where you were going, but some external thing came in and influenced your Weird, that created an orlog of that moment. And so, really, at the end of the day, we're only left with our option, our choice of how we're going to prepare ourselves, and then how we're going to respond to the orlog, the weird that is occurring. Um, and so this really gets into kind of our place in the world. Something I often like to say is you do not get to decide upon your fate. You can only choose to accept it and to make it better and to seek to make it better. And so, this is definitely a very integral part of a heathen worldview. We see this in the Voluspa, stanza 20, where it talks about the Norns carving on the wood. It says, on the wood they scored, laws they made, and life allotted to the sons of men, and set their fates. And that's a Bellows translation, and it literally is using the word orlog segya to set the first law. Fate is being translated orlog. And that word log is law. So it's literally saying that our fate is carved into Yggdrasil by the Norns, and that all men have a fate. And so, this is kind of what we're talking about, is that there is a mass tapestry, as it were, that is being at play of weird, and that defining orlog for what's going to come next. And so that really talks about how the cosmos works together through orlog and weird. So now let's talk about the different spiritual and physical beings that make up the world. And first, let's talk about spiritual. So we have gods and spirits in this world. As heathens, we believe that there exist numerous, diverse, supernatural beings, both that we would consider gods and some that we would just consider to be spiritual beings. This is because heathenry as a faith is both a polytheistic and animistic religion. And so polytheistic means that we believe that there is more than one god or deity out there. And animistic is belief that there is a spiritual aspect of the world that indwells the aspects of the world itself, right? So this can be anything from believing that animals have a spiritual nature to them, to the trees, the river, the rocks. There's a spiritual element to everything that exists. And so when we talk about deities and spirits in heathenry, this can become somewhat of a contentious topic. And again, our goal here is to just kind of keep it at a fundamental level. So, we have to ask ourselves, what is a god? How do we differentiate between what is a god versus what is just a cosmic force or entity? And really, it comes down to source and interpretation and personal, influence, really. Because, when we look at Norse mythology, we see recognized as gods the Aesir and the Vanir. And they seem to be distinct from what we see as the Jotun when we talk about the arch-heathens and the worship that they had. But there were definitely those that worshiped the Jotun as gods. So it really comes down to, for me, this is a personal perspective, but I think it's a lot of people share it, is that I particularly use the term God to define those beings that I worship that are, overall benevolent and interested in the well-being of mankind. And so that's what, that's the Aesir, the Vanir. They have a vested interest in humanity, partly because they created humanity, and I think that's an aspect of what godhood is as well, is that creation element. But really, we see some of the Aesir and Vanir that don't seem to have as much of an influence or interest in humanity, and some that do. And so then we see that throughout history. When we talk about the arch-heathens and their worship of various gods, there was a clear favoritism, I guess is a good word to use, towards certain deities. Thor, Frey, Odin were heavily worshipped throughout Scandinavia, more so than most of the other gods. with some of the other, gods like Freya also being heavily worshipped, but gods like Tyr maybe having, pockets of worship and veneration, but being definitely a lesser of a favorite, to use that term. And so really it's and we'll talk about this in a little bit when we talk about Frith and relationships and how we build them. But a lot of that comes into play when we talk about what is a god. And so heathens in general, again, we are polytheistic. We believe that there is more than one god. But when we decide upon, or we talk about, well, who are gods, who are the gods that we worship, that really is a personal interpretation of your own practice and your own tradition. And, it really talks about that difference between a worship of a divine being and reverence towards what is a spiritual cosmic force. So when we look at, arch heathenry, and we talk about, and even human, paganism in general throughout ancient history, a lot of what was considered gods were those cosmic forces that directly influenced the world and people. So, in Norse mythology, Thor is heavily associated to storms, which then leads itself into, crops and fertility and harvest, right? Because without water, you can't grow crops. But then you see Frey being used most often as a god of harvest, of fertility, of this, livelihood. And so, going through, we could break out, we could look at Greek and Roman and even Egyptian and all the different pagan faiths that are out there. They have these archetype beings that were influential and interactive in the world. And those then, through time became, they built relationships with them, understood them to be beings, set beings, gave them names that they could refer to them as. And so then we actually have our gods that we know today, Thor, Odin, Frey, and the others. And then when we talk about, the Aesir, the Vanir, the Jotun, and these beings as they existed in the arch-heathens perspective, my personal interpretation is just that these were less distinct races of beings and more tribes of beings that interacted with one another. We know that the Aesir and Vanir used to be distinct and separate. They had a war against each other, and then after the war they had a peace, and they traded members of their tribe to live with one another as a form of building that peace. And so eventually they kind of became considered one and the same. Whereas the Jotun, there never was that peace. They never bridged that gap. They were always kind of at odds with one another. And so that's how I look at it. I think that they're just various tribes of beings that existed contemporarily, that interacted, as opposed to being distinct and separate races of beings necessarily. And they could have been, but just we don't know one way or the other. It's also worth talking about, when we talk about the distinction between Aesir, Vanir, Jotun, who do we worship, who are gods. We talk about beings like Loki. Loki was a Jotun that was clearly accepted as an Aesir, a blood brother of Odin, but then was later cast out of the Aesir community or tribe. And then when we talk about his children, he had several children. None of them were ever seemed to have been considered anything but Jotun. Of course, they were, sired by Agarbotha. Now, he did have other children that were considered Aesir. And so really, and that's really why I think that there's a distinction of tribalism as opposed to, difference in beings themselves, because of that aspect. Loki went and had children with the Jotun giantess, and those children were considered to be Jotun themselves. But there are some heathens out there that venerate Loki as a god, and some that do not. And so it's really, then that's what I mean by saying, there's kind of a personal interpretation of what a god is, and how do we differentiate between those cosmic forces that we respect, because they are so much more and greater than what we are today, versus what we consider to be a god that we may worship and venerate directly. And then, of course, you have the spirits, the Vetir, those beings that are not necessarily gods or cosmic forces, but are just spiritual entities that exist only in that spiritual plane in the world around us, and we show respect to them, the Husvatir, the Land Vatir, as well. And then we talk about the physical being, the individual, the person, who we are, and what we are. We do believe that a being, an individual, the person, is made up of both multiple physical and spiritual aspects, and that this plurality of spiritual and physical aspects comprising the living being is not just unique to people, but may also exist in animals and all flora and fauna of the world. But what we do have representation of in our source material is related to the physical being of the human being, the individual. And there are 4 distinct aspects of the person that we recognize in heathenry that makes up part of our worldview. Those aspects are the Hamner, the Hugr and Munir, the Philia, and the Haminga. So the Hammer is just that physical body. It's the physical makeup. It's the part of us that when we die stays in the world. It's what we bury. It's what goes into the burial mound. So it's literally just that physical makeup. Eventually it will decay and become dirt and become part of the earth again. It's made up of the elements of science that form us. But we also have a Hugr and Munir, and this is the mind and memory, or the thought and memory. This is where Odin's ravens get their name. It's the mental aspect of who we are. It's hard to differentiate between whether they are 2 distinct, separate aspects, or if they're kind of part 2 halves of a whole. Hugr seems to be more of the physical perception of the world, where Munir seems to be more of that introspective, spiritual perspective of the world. But both of these exist in a non-physical aspect, right? These are both somewhat spiritual aspects of who we are. And they seem to be, this is the part of us that would then seem to carry over into the afterlife. So when we talk about the going into the dead, going to Valhalla or going to the afterlife, when we see those things, it's the Hugr and Munir that is probably what is being referenced here. We know that the Haminr stays in Midgard on the physical, and so the aspect that goes into the afterlife, the spiritual, is that Hugr and Munir. But we also have the Philia and the Haminga, and these tie into what we were talking about earlier about Orlog and Weird and luck. So Philia is this is really a very basic concept of guardian spirit. It's a aspect of our ancestry, and maybe you look at it as kind of a part of your ancestral luck, the weird that they've been building, your family has been building, your genealogy has been building, that is now manifested in something that has been given to you directly. And so you get a portion of your ancestral weird that you can then use in your life, or that kind of is influential in your life. Philia, there's references in the sagas to them taking on, the forms of animals, wolves and bears, ravens. There's even a superstition, as it were, that if you saw your Philia, if you saw your guardian spirit, it meant you were about to die. And so you see that in a couple places in the sagas as well. And so my understanding of this is that when the Philia, when you die, the Philia goes back into that ancestral weird. And that it is more of a, it's something that was given to you, something you borrow, and that may go back into, may given to one of your descendants later, or may have been used by one of your ancestors, right? And so this is, it seems to be highly involved in the Deseer, the matriarchal mothers of your family, and so. But that's kind of a little bit deeper into the meta-spiritual aspects of heathenry. We're not going to get too much into that right now. But you also have the Hamiya, which is kind of your own personal luck, your own personal weird, something that you've developed. And it may be something that is directly, maybe a little bit inherited from your direct parentage, right? Your mother and father, or maybe maybe your guardian or somebody. But it is definitely very unique to you, where Filja is kind of like an ancestral pool of luck and weird. Hamiya is very unique to you. It's something you build upon and grow in your whole life, and that it's kind of you have a store of or a well of. It can be depleted, and it can be shared even. There's sagas talk about kings that could share their Hamiya with their troops in battle so that they have great luck and victory. And so that aspect, Hamiya seems to be tied to the Alfar, or the fathers. And it kind of, my understanding, my interpretation is that this aspect of us is what, when we die, may go back into the world itself, right? It may be the spiritual aspect of the world that is incorporated in us for a time that we live. Because when we talk about the Alfar, they very much seem to be wild spirits of the world, but then are tied to the fathers of our family as well. And so, again, we're not going to get too deep into that in this lesson. Definitely something we can maybe talk about in a future lesson, but it makes up one of the other aspects of who we are. And so, when we talk about heathen worldview, right, and we talk about that ultimate question, why is this important? Why is life important? Why are we important? What is my value? And I truly believe, and I heard this first place I heard it was from Ocean Keltoy, and I think it's the greatest way to explain it is that for heathens, our value is that in this life, it is the only time that we will exist in this complete form, and that once we die, we will never exist in this form manifestation of these elements ever again. So this is the only time we get to exist as a Hamir, Hugar, Munar, Fili, and Hamiya all together, to then influence weird to create a greater Orlog, to create better Orlog. Right? So when we talk about what is the value of life is that this is the only chance we have to be and exist in this form. That when we die, maybe our Hamiya goes out into the spirit of the world, and part of us lives on there. Our Filja goes back into the ancestral pool and maybe gets passed on to one of our descendants. Maybe our Hugar Munar goes to the afterlife and we exist in a part there. Our Hamir decays and becomes part of the earth again. And maybe those parts, right? Maybe some of them live again in other ways and manifest in other ways, but they will never exist in this capacity again that will be equatable to you. And so this is a very, I take that and I interpret that as, I have a responsibility to use this to the best of my ability to create that better Orlog, right? And so that gets us into how do we understand our place and our role in this world? We talked about, the world around us, the cosmos, the spiritual and physical aspects of the world. We talked about, how fate, Orlog, and weird move and unite all of those things, as well as the spiritual and physical beings that exist in the world. But what is our place? What is our role, right? And so one of the most key elements of heathenry that frames a lot of our worldview is something that we call frith. And frith is the loyalty and bonds of faith that exist between us, the relationships that we build with one another. And that frith is, rooted in the arch-heathens' understanding of the world, that they were a tribal people, lived in small villages, and they lived in upper northern Europe, Scandinavia, with brutal winters, harsh climate, and in order to survive, just in order to exist, they had to know that they could trust and rely upon the other members of the village, not only to help them, but to do their part in the success of the village, right? Every one of them had a role to play, whether it was be farming, raiding as a Viking, blacksmith. They had a role that was unique, or that they owned, that was their responsibility. And everyone in the tribe and the village had to trust you were going to do your part. And so, that peace that village experienced was because of the security they had in one another, the trust that they built. That was then developed through this reciprocal exchange, and we'll talk about reciprocity in the next slide. But it was through this effort that was used to build these relationships, right? So frith really is effort and energy applied over time to develop a relationship. And it can be found, it's found in all aspects of our life, in what we call a frith web. And I heard that from Eric Wordweaver Sherman. He talked about that as a concept, and I think it's a great way to explain a frith. But you have this web of relationship in your life that starts with your most inner circle, your closest friends and family, maybe your parents, your siblings, then your spouse, your children, right? Those people that you are closest to, that you rely the most on, that you share the most with, and that you have the most obligation to. So that's the other half of frith, is that it creates obligation, and that the deeper that frith is, the stronger that bond, the more obligation you have to one another, and that those obligations then extend to other aspects of your frith web. So that if you have a sibling who has children, maybe you have nephews and nieces, maybe you have cousins, those people, you have some obligation to them through the frith bond that you have with your sibling and your parents, and then with your relationship with them personally, right? And so I'm sure we all have extended family members that we may not really know very well or talk to, but we still have some obligation to, because of the frith that we share between our other family members, right? Now, that obligation does have boundaries and limitations, right? The farther we get out from the center core of the frith web, yourself, the less that obligation is, and eventually we hit a point where there's really no obligation to you as an individual because of how far removed that frith is. So we see on the scale here, really, it's kind of a like I said, it moves everything, just like fate ties everything, Orlog and Weird tied everything in the world together, so does frith. So it starts with you as a person, then your family, then your local community, maybe your state or nation, the world itself, and even the cosmos, right? We talk about our gods and the cosmic forces, right? Frith is what unites all of them. And that web is overlaid, just like Weird and Orlog are influenced, fate is influenced by every decision made. Frith is another layer of that ties all of those decisions and aspects of the world together. And so, frith is a core central tenet of heathenry, and it really is why. We will talk about in the next slide why we have ritual, why we do bloat the way that we do. And then another aspect of frith, the relationship that we build can create obligation, but so can oaths. Something interesting about heathens is that we see oaths as being sacred. If you make an oath, we consider that to be something that you are bound to at a spiritual level. The reason being is because once you take an oath, you are, in effect, tying your weird to someone else into a sworn obligation that you are then expected to uphold. And to fail to uphold that would be detrimental to the frith and fate of all the people involved in the oath. A good example, the U.S. military. We take an oath when we join the military to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath is so expansive that it immediately creates an obligation of the U.S. service member to the entire nation. And that is, unique. We look at our table of frith here. Normally, you as an individual would not have an obligation of frith to everyone in the country. But when we swear an oath as a U.S. service member, we are immediately taking on ourselves an obligation of frith because of an oath, right? Now that wasn't established in any kind of relationship; it was purely based on that oath, but it immediately created that obligation that we would uphold. And so that's something to keep in mind when we talk about oath taking, is the obligation that will be created that you will then have to uphold as if it were a frith bond itself. So in order to build upon frith, in order to create those relationships and create that deep, sustained relationship, we have reciprocity. It is the sustained and symbiotic commitment that develops reliable frith. We call it the gifting cycle, and it's this process of giving that time, energy, and effort into a relationship that it then is mutually beneficial. So the other being in that relationship shares in that giving. They give their time, energy, and effort so that you then have an obligation to give back. And it just creates this deeper and deeper rooted relationship that is invested in both debt of obligation and trust of security and peace with one another. And so the amount of energy, effort, and time that you give, the value, as it were, of your gift, and how long you continue to do so is what develops that frith. And then every time it generates more obligation and indebtedness to that frith bond that then you share and you mutually benefit from. If you were to, if it was one-sided, if you were the only one, giving into this gift, you were the only one putting time, effort, and energy, there's no frith being developed there. It's not mutually beneficial. And so that's a key aspect of it. And that the deeper that frith bond is, the tighter that you are woven, your weird is woven in with that person, and the more that you that frith bond can absorb when we talk about that obligation and indebtedness. So let's say you were close friends with somebody, maybe it's a sibling, somebody that you trust explicitly and you love and you have great frith with. Maybe they flake out on you. Maybe you're supposed to go to lunch and they don't show up. There's probably someone in your life that you if that happened, you would be like, it's no big deal, right? But if it was somebody you just met and you didn't really have much of a relationship, you didn't have any frith built with them, and you tried to set up a lunch and go hang out with them, and they just flaked out, you'd probably be like, well, I guess they're not really, I guess they're not serious about this. I guess we're not, that you wouldn't consider that that would have a greater impact on your relationship because you don't have that frith bond to absorb that detriment, that lack of fulfillment of the obligation. And so when we talk about ritual, right? So going back to what we said a minute ago, why do we do ritual as heathens the way that we do? We do ritual because it is the avenue to engage the gifting cycle with a spiritual being. So again, we talked about those two distinct aspects, the spiritual and physical realm. We do ritual as a bridge between the physical and spiritual so that we may give gifts and engage in the gifting cycle with the spiritual in hopes that they will give us gifts back, usually in the form of influencing our weird through spiritual energy, luck, as it were, so that we have better weird and better orlog in the future. And so there's this, exchange, right? And that's why we do ritual the way that we do. And like I said, we'll talk about a lot of that in lesson 3. But it's also why we believe that it's so central to Heathen World View, because it is the way that we interact with our gods, our ancestors, our spirits, other people. It is the core of how we build relationships. And it's a simple concept, really. If you go to work and you get somebody new shows up at your work, and like I said, you ask them out to lunch. You guys go out to lunch, and you're like, "Hey, man, lunch is on me today. I'm gonna pay." Awesome, that's cool. Let's say the week after you go out to lunch again, and they're like, "Hey, I got it. This you had last time, I got this time, right?" And over time, as you guys do things for each other, you spend time together. You give energy. Maybe you're like, "Hey, let's go watch a football game, or let's go hang out on the weekend. Let's do something together." Maybe you invite them over to your house. And they meet your family. Maybe you meet their family. Your families start interacting. Over time, maybe you go to birthdays for one another's themselves or their family. Maybe you go for a holiday, right? You create these deep-rooted relationships over time that started off as just a simple, "How do you do?" But let's say you went to lunch that very first time, and you paid. And the next time you went to lunch, they didn't offer to help to pay for it. You paid, and you were like, "Well, I'm just going to pay for myself." Right? And maybe they never paid you back. Right? You would probably feel a little bit offended, taken back, like they were taking advantage of you. Maybe you'd write it off as not a big deal. But let's say you went out several times and you kept offering to pay, and they never offered to pay. Eventually, you'd probably stop being willing to go out to lunch with them. And you'd probably definitely stop being willing to pay. Now, let's go a little further. Maybe you don't go to lunch. Maybe you just get to know them in the office. Maybe you get to know them deeper and better. You build some frith, you build some relationship, and you come to understand that they got some financial trouble. Maybe they've got a family member who's got high medical bills that their money goes to. They can't afford to pay for it. You're going to be more considerate of that. You're going to be more aware of that, and that's going to have an impact on your relationship as far as you're absorbing that, hey, they never paid for lunch. Well, you understand they had a reason. But if you never build that frith, if you never build that relationship, if you never build that understanding, you're never going to get to that point where you appreciate them in that way. And so that's why frith is so important. It's so integral. It is deeply, as a heathen worldview, it is the core of our interactions with everything in the world, both other people and spiritual. And it's also why we look at things such as when that frith is broken, it is so devastating because it is such an intricately built web of fate, weird, frith, and luck, and all of that is deeply interwoven the deeper those bonds go. A good example is when a couple gets divorced, right? Marriage is probably one of the greatest manifestations of heathen ideology, in that you take an oath to somebody that you immediately have a deeply rooted frith bond with, and you slowly build a deeper, you're basically uniting your weird and your luck and the very aspects of your orlog together from your entire ancestry. And ultimately, you're creating future orlog for future generations. So when a divorce happens, it's devastating at a personal level, and at an extra person outside of your own self, because it fragments that weird and that frith and all those relationships, and that web is fractured and shattered when that happens. And sometimes that's necessary, right? Sometimes, going back to frith is a two-way, it's a mutually beneficial, right? And sometimes people get married and they swear this oath that creates this bond and this obligation, but then only one person is upholding it. and the other person is abusing that frith bond, maybe even actually abusing the other person and destroying that bond. And so that fragmentation, that separation is necessary because that frith bond is not being upheld. And so, but that's why can be so devastating. It can be so traumatic. There's so much more to that than just one relationship. There's an interwoven connection of all these relationships that is being torn asunder. So, again, very important that we look at oaths from a heathen worldview from that perspective, and we look at frith and the relationships we're building from that perspective, because it is very important why we are engaging in these relationships. And then another aspect of our heathen worldview is the term honor, or the concept of honor. But this is really all of those things we talked about a minute ago manifested in others' perception of you. And so honor, when we talk about honor from a heathen worldview, we're not talking so much about, the modern interpretation of honor really just being, that this person has good integrity, they're trustworthy. It really is deeper rooted into the arch-heathen perspective of honor as a sum total of the person, their both the reputation, the perception of others. It's how other people measure your frith obligation, the reciprocity with that you give, how well you uphold your obligations of frith. It is the summation of your whole person as it relates to the world. And that's a very important aspect of heathenry, because that ties into our sense of morality and ethics. Honor is that contribution we make to our community. The idea that what we do is more than what we say, that, again, an oath taken that is not fulfilled is dishonorable, right? It is a violation of frith. It is a failure to uphold our obligations. We talk about oaths. There's a distinction between what is a true sworn and witnessed oath versus just a promise or agreement. So a sworn and witnessed oath, as heathens, we consider that sacred. Just about every oath of office that is taken, whether here in the U.S. or in other places, almost all of them have very set ritual and rite that go to them. There's a specific format. You have to say a certain thing. You usually use some form of sacred totem to swear upon, right? So there's an invoking of sacredness. That oath has a strong obligation to it, versus just, hey man, I'll help you. You need help moving some stuff on Friday. I'll come over and help you move some stuff, right? Like that. There's a huge difference between what is a interpersonal agreement or promise versus what is a sworn sacred oath. While the agreement that you have made may have some obligation to it, that may or may not matter in the fulfillment of that. Again, if you were like, hey, I'll come help you move on Friday, but then you're like, hey, sorry, something came up and I have to change. That decision you made maybe because that's something that came up had a greater frith obligation. Maybe your kid got sick and they had to go to the hospital, and that is going to be a greater obligation than helping some friend, one of your friends move some stuff in their house. Versus a sworn oath has one of the highest levels of obligation, and that's something that you'd have to weigh very carefully. And then, like I said, this gets into what we consider to be heathen morality or ethics. Heathen morality, our ethics, what is right versus what is wrong, is tied to frith and the obligations and the upholding of frith. It's not about good or evil. Heathens do not have a perspective of sin. We don't believe in this, the idea of sin, which is an Abrahamic construct of defying a divine ordinance. We don't really believe in that. What we believe is that our frith obligations drives our morality and our ethical decision making. My actions as a parent, my decisions as a parent are going to affect my children, and if I make decisions that negatively affect my child, then that would be morally wrong of me as a heathen, because I have a frith obligation to care for and take care of my kid. The actions of a leader, of a king, of a president, right, are going to have effects on an entire nation of people. And so if they make decisions that poorly affect the nation, then as a heathen, I would consider that to be morally wrong. Uh, and this gets into, ethical decisions about, what is right and wrong as compared to, social laws or social customs. Good example that I like to use is if a parent were to steal a loaf of bread to feed their child, as a heathen, I see that as that's morally right. That's ethically right. There's nothing wrong with that, because they have an obligation to their child to care for them. Now, they may have violated a social law or social custom, and there may be consequences for that. That's because they're violating another, aspect of a frith web, because social customs and social laws, and even civil law, law itself, is a manner of trying to uphold this, this core, philosophical idea of a social contract. It's trying to uphold peace and security. It's frith. It's trying to legalize or legislate basic tenets of frith between citizens of a centralized community. But if I have a higher obligation to my child to make sure my child is fed, that social obligation, I may have to break that social obligation to meet the higher obligation of my child. And as a heathen, that is morally right. That I would see that as morally right. Now, you'd have a hard time convincing me that if somebody were to go steal a television, the ethical rightness of that as far as upholding of a heathen frith obligation. But there's that aspect of, like I said, when we talk about ethics, morality, from a heathen worldview, this is what we're talking. It really gets into the frith and how we and honor as a concept is the sum total of how we carry ourselves and how we are morally and ethically right as a heathen to our community and to the upholding of our frith. And then finally, the last thing we'll discuss is just the concept of legacy, of dynasty, is what I like to call it. Why are we here? What is the purpose of all of this? We talked about the value of life being the sum total of our being existing only in one time. But why do we exist? Why is that the case? And I believe really, and as a heathen, our worldview perspective is it comes back to frith and fate. That our life is a journey towards dynasty. And dynasty is the summation of heritage and legacy. Heritage being the orlog that we have received, and legacy being the orlog that we will leave. Heritage is that accumulation of ancestral luck. It is what our parents did, our grandparents are in, all the way back to the gods themselves that made us. The choices they made created an orlog that we have received. And that heritage will grow weaker with time. The decisions of my great-great-great-great-grandfather may not have a drastic influence on my day-to-day life. However, for a personal example, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, it was like 5 times removed, left his family, abandoned them, broke all of his frith obligations. And when he did, he left a wife and 3 children. And those 3 children, she later remarried another man whose name was Wilburn. And so our family name changed as those younger children were not adopted, but were taken in by this new family. And we descend from that 3rd son. And so the entire trajectory of our family lineage changed because of the actions of my 5th generation removed grandfather. Going back even more generations, so that grandfather's last name was Longoria. And they have come from a Spanish family that moved to Mexico and then southern Texas. And so if that family had not left Spain 1,000 years ago, so many years ago, 100 years ago, and that would have, then my family probably would have still lived in Spain, and I would have arguably changed the entire trajectory of my existence. And so while the day-to-day aspects of my life may not be influenced by the decisions of my ancestors, some aspect of my orlog certainly was. And then what I do, and the things that I am choices I make, are creating a legacy that I'm going to leave for my children that is going to influence future generations of my family lineage. The legacy I leave, the summation of all of my effort in this life, is feeding into the weird that I'm creating and establishing an orlog. It developed the luck of my family, the frith web that we have. It creates the heritage for all of my descendants. And that, at the end of the day, is the point, is why are we here? It is to create this dynasty, to establish this future for those that are going to come later, and hopefully to make it better. We see in the Havamal, stanzas 76 and 77, say, "The cows die, family die, and you will die the same way. But a good reputation never dies for the one who earns it well. I know only one thing that never dies, the reputation of the one who's died." And we see this in manifest in the reality of, we look at history. Today we still recognize the names of his people in history that had great reputations, great legacy, whether for good or bad, right? But they were great. They were significant. They were such a great reputation that has transcended time itself. The entirety of Norse mythology is really a summation of that. And so the purpose, Heathen World View, when we talk about why we are here and what is the purpose, it is for that reason. It is to leave a greater legacy that establishes a greater heritage, that establishes this orlog for those future generations. So here we have some of the references that I used throughout the lesson today. And again, this will be available online. You can go and check these out. Just want to point out that the presence of any of these references doesn't necessarily constitute endorsement, and certainly doesn't constitute any affiliation by our community. But they are places that I was able to find information that I thought were good for our community. If you have any questions or would like to reach out to us, feel free. You can check out our website, militaryheathens.org. You can send us an email at amh.council, and we would love to hear from you and help you further your journey in heathenry. We thank you for joining, and we will talk to you next time.